The grand estate of the Okafors loomed over the city like a silent god. It was a fortress of wealth, power, and secrets. At its heart sat Madam Veronica Okafor, a woman whose name alone sent shivers through the servants' quarters. She had built her legacy on fear, control, and an obsession with her family's lineage. Her son, Chukwudi, was the crown jewel of her empire, a brilliant businessman, groomed to perfection. And when he brought home his wife, Amaka, Madam Veronica had welcomed her with a forced smile, hiding the disappointment thawing at her soul. "You must give us strong heirs," she had whispered to Amaka on her wedding nights, her cold fingers pressing into the young woman's shoulder. "A wife who cannot bear children is as useless as a dry riverbed." Years passed, and Amaka's womb remained silent. No child's cry echoed through the mansion. No tiny feet pattered along its marble floors. Madam Veronica's patience ran dry. Her whispered insults became loud, cutting like knives. "Barren woman," she would hiss as Amaka passed. "You eat the food of this house, yet you cannot bear fruit." The servants learned to look away when Madam Veronica slapped Amaka across the face for the smallest mistakes. Chukwudi, once loving and protective, had grown distant. His mother's venom had seeped into his bones. "Maybe you should see another doctor," he muttered one evening. Amaka had seen many. The verdict was always the same. "You are perfectly fine. There is no medical reason for your infertility." Then why couldn't she conceive? One cold night, as the rain pounded against the windows, a frail old woman appeared at the mansion gates. "I have a message for the lady of the house," she told the guards. Madam Veronica, draped in her expensive silk, met the old woman with a smirk. "What nonsense do you bring?" The old woman lifted her veined hand and pointed at her. "The womb you curse is the one you sealed." Madam Veronica's smile froze. "A childless woman walks in this house not because she is barren, but because of the sins buried beneath your feet." The old woman turned to Amaka. "Seek the river at midnight. The truth waits in the dark water." And with that, she vanished into the storm. That night, Amaka did not sleep. Her mind replayed the old woman's words. The next evening, when the house was silent, she stole away into the night, heading for the river. The water shimmered black under the moonlight. A strange pull guided her feet into the shallows. Then she saw it. A hand, small, skeletal, reaching up from the mud. Her scream ripped through the forest, but no one heard her. Trembling, she dug into the earth with her bare hands until she uncovered a tiny skull wrapped in decayed cloth. A baby's bones, memories that were not hers, rushed into her mind. A younger Madame Veronica, standing over a crying maid. "You dare carry my son's child? You think a common girl like you can give him an heir?" The maid, clutching her belly, begging. A struggle, a muffled scream, a shallow grave dug by desperate hands, and a whisper that cursed the Okafor bloodline forever. "No woman shall bring life to this house again." Amaka stumbled back to the mansion, her dress soaked in mud and tears. She burst into the grand sitting room where Madame Veronica lounged with a glass of wine. "You killed her," Amaka whispered. Madame Veronica's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "You buried your grandchild beneath the river." Amaka's voice shook. Silence. Then the old woman's words came back. "The womb you curse is the one you sealed." Suddenly, the chandelier flickered. The wind howled through the mansion. A small cry echoed from the walls. Madame Veronica stiffened. What was that? Then, a shadow moved. A figure stood in the hallway, tiny and frail, with hollow, glowing eyes. A child's voice whispered, "Mama." Madam Veronica's glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. The lights exploded. The room plunged into darkness, and then she screamed. The next morning, the mansion staff found Madam Veronica coiled in a corner, rocking back and forth, whispering prayers to a god who would not answer. She never spoke again. The doctors said it was a stroke, but Amaka knew the truth. That night, she felt something inside her, a warmth, a movement, a tiny heartbeat. And 9 months later, she gave birth to a son. The curse had been lifted, but the walls of the Okafor mansion would forever whisper with the cries of the unborn. Amaka's son, Chimezi, was born on the coldest night of the year. The midwives whispered that the wind carried voices that night, the voices of the unborn. Madam Veronica, now a shadow of herself, refused to lay eyes on the baby. She remained locked in her room, staring at the walls, her lips moving in silent prayers. But even in her madness, she could hear the soft giggles in the hallway at odd hours. One evening, a maid rushed into the kitchen, trembling. "I saw him," she whispered to the cook. A little boy standing at the staircase. He looked just like the madame's grandson, but it wasn't him. His feet weren't touching the ground. The whispers spread through the mansion. Doors slammed shut on their own. Candle flickered, even without wind. And at night, a child's laughter echoed through the corridors. Laughter that belonged to no living soul. Amaka felt the air in the house grow colder. Something had changed since Shimezi's birth. One night, as she cradled her newborn, she heard soft footsteps outside her bedroom door. "Chukwudi," she called, assuming it was her husband. No answer. Then, a tiny handprint appeared on the glass window. Amaka's breath caught in her throat. She rushed to the door and flung it open. The hallway was empty, but in the dim light, she saw it. A small figure standing at the far end of the corridor, his black eyes fixed on her. The ghost child, the one buried beneath the river. Amaka was no stranger to spirits. She had grown up with stories of vengeful ancestors and cursed souls. She knew a ghost remained because of unfinished business. And this one wanted justice. That night, Amaka crept into Madame Veronica's room. The old woman sat stiffly in her chair, her eyes wide, unblinking. She had not spoken in weeks, but when she saw Amaka, her lips trembled. "He won't leave," Amaka whispered. Madame Veronica's eyes darted around the room as if she too could see the spirit. "You must confess," Amaka pressed on. "Tell the world what you did." For the first time in months, Madame Veronica's voice cracked through the silence. "If I do," she croaked, her voice hoarse from disuse, "he will kill me." That very night, the mansion trembled. A thunderstorm raged, the wind howling through the trees like 1,000 grieving mothers. The lights flickered violently. Then, the doors slammed shut. A child's wail pierced the air, sharp and heart-wrenching. Amaka ran to Chimezi's room. The baby was crying, his tiny fists clenched, his body trembling with fear. And beside the crib, the ghost boy stood. His black eyes met Amaka's, filled with something ancient and sorrowful. Madame Veronica's scream tore through the mansion. By the time Amaka reached her mother-in-law's room, it was too late. Madame Veronica was slumped in her chair, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Her eyes were wide open, staring at something no one else could see. And across her wrinkled face were tiny ghostly handprints. Chukwudi rushed in behind Amaka, his face pale with terror. He shook his mother's body, but there was no response. She was gone. The moment Madame Veronica took her last breath, a chilling whisper filled the room. "Justice has been done." The ghost child turned to Amaka one last time. Then, he vanished. After Madame Veronica's death, the mansion grew quiet. The whispers faded. The laughter disappeared. The air felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. Chimezie grew strong and healthy. Amaka watched him, knowing he had been spared from a curse that had plagued the Okafor family for years. Chukwudi, shaken by everything that had happened, tried to make amends. He held his wife closer. He apologized for every time he had turned a blind eye to his mother's cruelty. But some wounds take longer to heal. One evening, as Amaka walked past the river, she stopped at the spot where the old woman had told her to dig. She whispered a prayer for the forgotten maid, for the child who had never known love. And as she turned to leave, the wind carried a soft sound, a child's laughter, distant but free. The mansion would never be haunted again, but the story of Madame Veronica's sins and their consequences would be told for generations. Because some ghosts do not haunt out of malice. Some haunt to seek justice.